Douglas Katz. I love talking to veterans. I mean, they just have such a different, unique spin on just everything. Doug has created a knife. He does a lot of cooking. He is disabled, so he needed a knife that can better help his upper body, shoulder issues. It's a fascinating take. He's just a hobbyist cook and chef like myself. He saw this need. He's gone through many prototypes. He's come up with this great invention. It's called the Nulu. It's a type of knife. We walked through the journey of how he got there, asked what the purpose is and what his spin is on it. Just the way veterans approach problems like that, and then many of them want to just not only solve it themselves but take it to market so others can use it and benefit from, as this focuses in a particular area. But it's just a great conversation with a really interesting, really smart man, Doug Katz. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for listening and watching. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic, I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business? And it lasted over 25 years. Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission, how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family and their passion and their careers and how it helped them. Our podcast vision, growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration. Doug Katz, thank you so much for your time today. Doug, is military entrepreneurial school?
What's that? It is. Oh, yeah. I 100% didn't know until I became entrepreneurial. But I 100% feel that, a little bit on both sides, right? On one side, being able to deal with uncertainty and a lot of competing priorities, but also I think there's kind of a dopamine rush of being in that kind of environment and, consistently every day having new challenges, as opposed to the challenge being, how do I not get fired from the job I'm in? I guess you're kind of doing that as an entrepreneur, but from a different angle, right?
Do you want to connect with business leaders and engage consumers who take action? The Joey Pinz podcast delivers high-impact conversations to an audience of decision makers, entrepreneurs, and professionals across multiple industries. A fast-growing audience of highly engaged listeners, both B2B and B2C. Millions of listens and views across YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Brands that sponsor us see real engagement, conversations, and brand loyalty. Whether you're looking to sell a service, promote a product, or establish thought leadership, our sponsorships offer premium ad placements, exclusive episode sponsorships, full season branding, and event partnerships. Don't just advertise, become part of the conversation. Visit us at joeypinz.com/sponsor to get started, or email us at sales@joeypinz.com. Joey Pinz Podcast, where thought leaders, brands connect. And when you were in the military, you didn't really view it as such.
No, but it's a good question, because I think people like me do go into, let's say, I went to West Point, and you go there saying two things. I'm going to serve my country. I'm going to fulfill my commitment. But after that, a lot of times it's about, how does that network benefit me later? I've started to see that confluence of how that benefits you later is the same way it benefits the investment that the country made in you, in that, you bring that same character and that same poise and the same values to the commercial world, the private sector, and I think that benefits everybody. But I definitely feel that more military veterans should pursue entrepreneurial pursuits, because I think that they would find there's actually less risk than they're attributing to it. I think sometimes conventional wisdom, 99% of businesses fail, or whatever is thrown out there, is not necessarily a good statistic to make a life decision. If you have grit and you have the ability to deal with uncertainty and you understand and can build risk into everyday decisions, you're already much further along than many would be entrepreneurs would be. And I think the military does build that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I work out not as much as I should, but I always think to myself, this is the hardest part of my day, right? I'm really
Hmm.
strenuous. But when you're in the military, I mean, you're put in positions that you're not going to really see in the civilian world. So it
Right.
prepares you. It can't be as bad as that. And that's really kind of undervalued
I
in the
think
civil world.
so. It's a lot a lot less interesting than many. Right. There's a lot of sitting around, even when you're in the field. There's when you're in garrison, or if you're in a staff role, it's not dissimilar to a private sector role. But I think the way people approach it and the purpose, and I think that's another thing. I think that's sort of a tragic thing when you look at private sector military, is that even the most minuscule job, you can attribute some degree of purpose to it, because it's all in support of defense of our nation and everything that comes along with military service.
Mhm.
That's not really there on the outside. So dealing with a crappy job or a difficult boss or something, if you don't have that thread of purpose, it is pretty tough. And I think that is um, impacting our vets today, right? They're not finding that same kind of thing. You look after World War II, I read some statistic, don't quote me on its validity. 85% of businesses were small businesses, and a large percentage of those were owned by veterans.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a certain, you know, all the things we talked about, right? The ability to just wake up every day, do what you got to do, deal with the uncertainty, and know that the next day is going to be completely different, but you have the skills to deal with it. But I also think, with a charged political world right now, I think one thing the military does provide, and I hope is kept, is an ability to deal with all different kinds of people.
Mm.
You're mission focused, so it doesn't matter if you like this person or don't like this person.
Mm.
You can gain respect on a wider spectrum, and I think that helps in business. Right? It's not about what my personal bugaboos are about anything. It's about what's the mission of that business, and let's work with who we need to make things happen.
Hmm. Yeah, your adaptability is certainly increased. What should civilians know about life at West Point?
I think that you gotta live by some degree of a code,
Mm.
and that sounds trite, but I know that I see consistently from my colleagues and contemporaries who attended their commitment to duty, honor, and country. That are the things that you make a commitment to when you enter that institution. And but I think that people really should walk away saying you're always a leader, even if you're not a leader.
Mm.
Um, at its core, aside from being the first engineering school in the country, West Point is a leadership laboratory. And the one thing that cannot be recreated, is at other academies, is the immersion experience of leadership, where, okay, you're not done at the end of the day. Every people are still watching you, and that leadership permeates everything. It permeates how you approach working in a group environment. in, and I'm going to steal this from a podcast I heard, but your success being in the agency of others. Well,
Hmm.
that's just another way of saying that as a leader, it's servant leadership. The people who have put their faith in you, either above or below you, have allowed you to rent that position long enough that you show that you're a able leader in that role. And I think too many times people say it's their role or it's their team. It's not. They're leading it, but it's not their team. The accountability occurs with them, and that should give some degree of leverage with decisions, right? Hey, if the buck stops with me, I'm the one making the decision. But a belief in any way that a team is in the service of that individual uh, is just marked that that person really shouldn't be in that role because they're not valuing it the way they should.
Yeah, as a civilian, I have this kind of, West Point's very militant. You're right. You're living by a code. I never realized it was the first engineering school, but the Army Corps of Engineers is highly sought
Oh
after,
yeah.
right? Yeah, I mean, it's really, I mean,
Well,
uh,
and it's more just it was when it was founded, there was an understanding that you needed professional engineers within the military and civilian ranks.
mm,
And up until it was way before my attending there, you could not graduate with anything but an engineering degree.
mm,
So it goes even beyond sort of the Corps of Engineers or the engineering branch. It's about a way of doing things. And I was what's called a management major. I'm sure I will take some crap from any of my classmates and such who might be listening to this because it was basically business, a business equivalent, right? The same skill set. If you were to try and look and say, "Hey, I want my time here to apply to what I'm going to do outside," that was a management major, but I still had to take the equivalent of a minor in some type of engineering. And for a guy like me, who up until I started making things, didn't think I had an affinity for making things, or thinking through the physical world, I took what's called systems engineering, which was more or less a way of looking at problems and the world with an engineering mindset. And I think that that's something that can exist beyond the academies, right? I think the academies are very good at doing it because you can see that direct application in when you go to the field. Or I was lucky enough to never have to serve in combat. I was deployed at one point, but I was fortunate. Um, that thought process of being able to attack a problem very, very quickly, very logically, optimize what solution is going to be best and go with that solution. um, that is a really, really good skill to have. And I think that we should be thinking more like, how do our civilians do that, right? Like if someone doesn't go through a military experience, how can they pick up sort of that same practicality and pragmatism in how they do things?
hmm. Doug, what is the purpose of a knife?
Well, it depends, right? This is where we um have run into some resistance, right? Ultimately, the purpose of a knife is to extend somebody's capabilities, right?
Mm,
Depending on what that task is. And a knife is unique in that, cutting and stabbing is sort of an essential survival array of portfolio of tasks that you need to have. Now, ultimately, as our society formed, right, as we became non nomadic and moved into more civilized societies, domestic societies, well, then you had the ability to more specialize, right? And that's a broad brushstroke, but ultimately, then the purpose of the knife changes. It becomes an enhancer for a particular task that you otherwise could not have done with a sharp edge. Now, it can be steel, but many cultures who didn't have access to steel had, I think even today, some of the sharpest knives are obsidian, right?
mm,
So it's really, it depends on how you define a knife. I think if you look at it as what is the purpose of a blade, then it
Mm.
really sort of changes, right? Because you have all these different shapes, you have all these different use cases, and you have what should work best in those use cases. And ultimately, if you were to ask that same question to an array of people,
Mm.
you would get a very interesting array of answers. And many, I think, you would find are connected to more abstract thinking, right? If you look at blades across cultures, right? Crusaders, where a functional aspect of their sword, that cross hilt that would protect them in fighting and could be used in fighting, had a cross, if you turn it around, and it has this connection. The samurai had a unique connection to their blades. If you watch chefs, there's a unique connection. So um, it sort of transcends utility into culture and identity and jobs people do. So it's a very, very, what we're finding is it's a bigger thing than we would have thought.
Hmm. So why look into it? Why try to improve it?
Because just because there's a certain connection, right? Like any disruptor, and I like to consider myself that, looks and says, just because this is the way things are right now, doesn't mean that that's the best experience. Now,
Mm.
if I had said pulling from air conceptually this knife, I think it would have been different. There's an aspect of an engineer who looks and says, wait a minute, something works really well. Why does it work well? Is there something to that is not being fully leveraged? Then can that become the basis of design? So my own story was I needed it, right? We're talking about the definition of a knife. And in certain times of mankind's history, you would have had to have a knife to defend yourself, to hunt, to eat, right? The fork was only invented, you know, a couple thousand years ago. And I'm probably getting that wrong, but compared to the knife, which goes back to, again, flint knives. So, for me, I was looking at saying, okay, there are certain designs that are better, and not being. I love cooking. I'm a you know hobbyist culinary enthusiast, and I'm also a knifesmith. And I think I'm a better engineer than a knifesmith or a better inventor, because during a particular time of issues with my upper body, right before I had my shoulder reconstructed, I couldn't do either very well. So, you can make knives different ways, right? You could take out a hammer and pound it out, or you can remove material to shape that blade, called stock removal. And I keep, I'm like any knife smith. I keep a bunch of crap around my shop to experiment with. You don't want to use your best stuff for experimentation. I had circular saw blades sitting around because they're usually good. They can hold an edge and you can prototype stuff. So I created a knife that was more or less reminiscent of an ulu, which is an Inuit knife, that was actually called the everything knife, because women would use the ulu, and they could do anything from skin an animal, prepare a meal, cut a kid's hair. It was a very good utilitarian knife. But there were certain design components that were limiting. So I started thinking in terms of circular, and why does it work, and circular force transfer. And initially, it wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna apply a certain geometry to this. It was, oh, why does it work? Are there any other parts of the blade that I'm not using? I tend to really be about optimization. That's just something that has stuck with me. So, I'll walk into a house, if my wife and I've had several houses, and look and say, okay, how can you optimize this space, right? How can you make a 3-bedroom feel as big as possible? That kind of thinking. So that's what came across with the Nulu, and I don't know if this is video as well,
Oh,
but
yes.
this is our last prototype, and that's where this other blade came in, because you can use it in different ways. And what we came up with was a term called force transfer geometry. Because when it worked, That was just me at the company at that point. And then I started to pick up people along the way. And what it comes down to is if you think of a straight knife, it's linear. So any force that you're applying, you're applying downward force. It's like a seesaw without a fulcrum. So if you look at how, and I think I actually have a knife down here. If you look, and this is totally not a good knife, but it's just a knife I was playing with. But if you look at how, if you're trying to cut down, it applies a lot of stress to your hand, elbow, shoulder, and again, you would be at counter level. If you're holding it like a chef holds it like this.
Mm.
Well, this is just a difficult grip. If you have any hand issues, it causes issues, and believe it or not, the handle then becomes balance. So when you said why look at a knife a different way, if you're gripping it by something other than the handle, and the handle becomes balance, that's not a need for technique, it's a need for redesign.
Mm.
But when you move that control area over the cutting area, now the transfer of force is direct, right? You're not seeing me have to white knuckle things, and this is sharp, so I'm being careful.
Mm.
But you
Please.
can also now pick up a lot of utility. You can slice, you can chop, this way or slice this way. You can use a hammer type movement to chop this way, but also if turned around, you can cleave, you can chop this way if that feels better, or you can really precision cut and julienne. And now, because you don't need that tip, it's safer. We don't need a tip, right? Like, as I said back, if you look through our history, you may have to protect yourself from the guy sitting next to you who might have a beef, right? If you're talking about when people carried a knife everywhere they went, we're not there. So this is about optimization in the kitchen, or anywhere you might be doing cutting. I mean, it's actually, the utility is in the cutting, but because you saw all the different ways you could use it, well, you could use it in a field kitchen if you're into camping, or things like that.
Hmm. And how long did it take you to arrive to this prototype, Doug?
I am really, again, I'm really fortunate. So the first prototype that I built, was a lot more rudimentary. It was really just kind of starting out. And I tried a couple of other designs kind of over a 2 or 3 month period, with the first partner that I picked up who understands design. He was a toy designer for many years,
Hmm.
and was not a knife guy. So the ability to get here was a lot me willing to give up ownership of an idea. I didn't
Mm.
give up my connection to it, but if I were to say it's just my idea, then we wouldn't have gotten there. So when he came on board, I said, "You're the designer, make it beautiful," because
Hmm.
he knows how to do that.
Hmm.
So we've been at it about 2 years. But I can tell you, this is an earlier prototype. And for anyone watching or listening, this prototype was built, this was on a 3D printer. This was
Hmm.
on, oddly enough, to do some of the grinds with this, it was easier to do on a cheap grinder that I picked up from Harbor Freight than it was on a more expensive grinder that I used to make more traditional knives. And we just ordered these blanks. Now, this is not production steel. You have to consistently sharpen this, but I think these cost us $4 or $5. So we could try different grinds. We could try. So prototyping it was, it's really only been a couple, I don't know, maybe a year and a half. Then once we moved into really manufacturing and things with this was sent to us from the manufacturer, so that we're getting an idea. This is production steel. This is not yet a production handle, because we got this about 6 months ago from the manufacturer. But people should not, I mean, being in a time where we are with inexpensive tools, um, access to very, very powerful technology, an ability to understand what patents might already be out there,
Mm.
an ability to, and when I say technology, of course, AI, but an ability to ideate with something that is going to tell you what all the issues are with a great, with what you think might be a great idea. And it may be a great idea, but let's say you go talk to somebody who doesn't understand that market, they may talk you out of it. Your great idea ends there. If you're talking to something like an AI platform that can tap, if you say, hey, take the position of an investor, and I'm pitching an idea. You're a friend of mine and you're an investor, and I want you to blow holes in my idea.
Hmm.
Well, now you're doing it constructively, and you may be able to go in that direction. So, what I would tell people is it really isn't about how long I took to prototype it, because when we made this, the technology, this was like a year and a half ago. Now, to make it, I would have a completely different approach
Hmm.
because things are moving that fast. So I think if people are, if they want to pursue something like that, the ability now to do it, I'm going to say a side hustle, but the ability to prototype, research, come up with an idea, and get to a point where you decide if you want to spend money, maybe to get somebody to help prototype it if that's just not your thing, or find a partner who now you can sell on the vision. A couple of my partners, like I'm the guy who invented this, right? So a couple of my partners said it was about you and your passion, and me understanding the need, but well, if you have all the other things covered, then you can better communicate to somebody who may be a key strategic partner in getting your idea off the ground.
So this is your Nulu, Nulu,
Yep.
and the goal of the knife is what?
Well, we want to redefine cutting, right? We're starting in the adaptive space. You always want to start where there's a need. And if you're doing something like taking on thousands of years of human history and evolution, and a connection to a particular blade shape, it's difficult. So we're starting very much in the adaptive space. But what we learned is adaptive is just better. So when we say redefine cutting, the people who will spend money to buy it are going to be ones who look and say, oh, like, I love my $1,000 chef's knife, but I'm cooking less because when I use it, it hurts. No matter how sharp it is, when I use it, it hurts.
Hmm.
Well, enter the Nulu, right? They're able to use that in a way to keep independence. That's why we focused on that market. And what we did was we stopped and said, because the initial reaction, as you can guess, is, how much market is there for an adaptive knife?
Right.
How many disabled people are there? The answer is it's pretty darn big, because I'm going to go back to the Army here. When you put an engineering hat on and you say, okay, and you mirror it with the military, and in the military, at least the Army, when you are evaluated, there's a task by certain condition and standards, right? So you look and you say, can you do this task to the conditions and standards that are set forth to evaluate the task? Anything less than that, you're not as able. So we started to look at it and say, well, wait a minute. If we look at it from a scale, and we say, instead of saying able-bodied or disabled, we're saying, let's look at what the task is, and then let's define it in a different way, because age is a disability in and of itself. You
Hmm.
get degraded strength, dexterity, and coordination. But age is also a disability in and of itself when you're younger, because if you're doing a grown-up task, you may be appropriately strong, coordinated, and dexterous for a 10-year-old, but you're not for a task that an adult might be doing. So then when you start to look and say it's really about strength, coordination, and dexterity, and not about someone's identification or your identification of them as able or disabled, you get what we created, which we call the ability curve. And when you do that, you're able to stack the different markets that this would apply to. So instead of saying MS, we're saying people with upper extremity issues. But that means that there is a convergence of MS and Parkinson's and arthritis and age and
Hmm.
you can what is it, lupus, Lyme disease, all these autoimmune diseases that affect that upper extremity issue. It could be injuries too, right? It could be, hey, I have my shoulder rebuilt, like is what I did, and the recovery for that's like 2 years. Well, for 2 years you're disabled. Are you not going to cook, right?
Mm.
So that's where we focused in the beginning, and what I think we're expecting, because our Nulu is a brand underneath a bigger company that many of my partners and I are involved in, that we're more or less creating a venture studio. And what we like to say there is adaptive, assistive, and adjacent. So anything that's adaptive for somebody who has a disability is going to be assistive for someone who doesn't. That creates other markets for us, right? So we can look at the Nulu and say, well, wait a minute. You don't have to trade out knives when you're working in your workspace. There's a productivity gain. You can cut faster and safer. Again, a productivity gain. Your employees, I'm putting the hat on now of somebody who owns a commercial kitchen or food prep thing. I'm actually meeting today with someone who does prepared meals for people. And what's interesting is he's a boxer, and some of the force transfer, right? If you were to look at like a punch, right? Well, it's kind of the same thing, right? You want efficient transfer. And he goes, oh, I totally get it. So I'm actually bringing it by this afternoon, and some of his guys are going to try it. So he sees the assistive benefit, right? If he takes care of his people, they're not going to get carpal tunnel. They're not going to get tired. They can prepare more meals in a shorter amount of time. So we are right now also experimenting, and I have a draft. I want to proof it out with a calculator that says, okay, like, tell me about your business, and can we save you time and money in a commercial kitchen?
Your brand deserves to be in front of the right audience decision makers, entrepreneurs, and professionals who are ready to take action. That's exactly who listens to the Joey Pinz podcast. Thousands of engaged business leaders and consumers tune in every week. Millions of views and listens across YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Sponsors see real impact, higher engagement, brand trust, and conversations. We offer strategic partnerships tailored to your goals, including targeted ad placements, branded guest appearances, multi-episode and event sponsorships. Make your brand part of the conversation. Let's grow together. Visit joeypinz.com/sponsor to explore sponsorship opportunities.
Doug, do we have your shoulder reconstruction?
The Joey Pinz podcast, the gift of this knife to that?
No, you know what? It's just being active, right? Like I'm a disabled vet. None of my disabilities for my upper body were rated, right? So when you're a vet, when you get your disability, they like look at your service record, they look at your claims, they look and they go, oh, I see where this happened. But there's no doubt that my military service, my time playing rugby, my time, if you've had an active lifestyle, you probably have issues. I think it was more about looking and saying, I don't want the problems I have, be them from the military or from other things that I may have done, to be a limiting factor. I think that anything that you can do to make your life easier is just smart. And for me, the time, I guess if you were to say, when had I had enough? And when was the problem pronounced enough to create the situation where I said, all right, I'm gonna do this? Then yeah, I would say it's that. But now that has happened, there are other products and ideas that we're exploring as a company, because I'm looking and saying, okay, I know how to do this, and I'm practicing what I preach, right? I could look at something and say, wow, this is a great idea. Can I commercialize it? Well, I can do that in an evening now, right? Where before it took a lot of effort. So where I'm doing a lot of the strategy and business development work with my team, I can do that now with a lot of different things, with improvements for the Nulu, right? Our roadmap is very much going to be about, this isn't perfect. I would love to say it is, but it's not perfect, right? By moving the control area, it's harder to cut a watermelon. So there are things that we can do better or apply some of the same thought process and problem solving paradigms that we used for Nulu. So we're looking at Nulu having a very robust roadmap, but also similar products that I guess I heard it best from a friend of mine. He said, it was a guy with MS, and he said, it's about the, and I'm going to butcher the thing, like the huge impact of small improvements, right? So there's a lot of great technologies that are coming out there that are very heavy technologies. Sometimes it really is only about like, hey, I can't reach behind my back. How do I scratch my back, right? Like just simple things that everybody deals with. The big problem with that is how do you bring in investment? And that's been probably our biggest obstacle is physical products are just a little bit harder. Getting to market with physical products often require, as it seems, bootstrapping to a point that you can proof out revenue. I think for us, it's going to be finding angels and seed money that are connected with the product. Maybe they had a family member with Parkinson's, or something like that. But it's definitely a different process than I think a lot of my colleagues have gone through to raise money.
You make a point, Doug, of saying that your team consists of veterans professionals all over 50. Why is 50 kind of a benchmark for you?
I remember reading about 10 years ago a article in ProPublica that was talking about ageism. And it really hit me because I was like, this really makes sense. And it talked about how corporate America, and I get why, is not kind to its older workers, right? It is very much about, cheaper, who's going to work harder, who's going to hustle. But what is lost in that, I think, is wisdom, poise, experience, and purpose. So what I have found is, and you got to find the right people, obviously, but my team has a very, very purposeful approach to what we're doing, right? We all want to make money, but everyone is very connected to the use case because we're all beat up. Many of us have been caretakers or will become caretakers. So we understand the market. Many are in a good financial position, but not necessarily made for the future. And as a result, can either put money toward this or are willing to work for sweat equity. And I think egos are, they're just really, there isn't a lot of egos. So while some people are part-time, I think everybody affiliated and associated with this enterprise look and say, hey, I'm probably one of the younger ones out of some of us at 54. Any job you have is going to likely be in jeopardy at any day at that age. And the time to find a new job takes longer. The time to, or how much you get paid is going to be less. That was the gist of that article. And I've seen it. So I have gotten very much about finding these people, right? So for one of the things that we're going to be bringing to market, I need to find somebody who's a tech person. I'm going to do the same thing because right now these people know how to code. With AI, they could probably get me to minimum viable product on the tech side of what I'm looking at doing, and they can be in a position to benefit from equity. Another interesting thing that I am hearing, and it's an echo of what I'm thinking, is more and more people in that age group are looking at how the world is unfolding and saying, I want to have a legacy for my kids. And I want to have a business that if they so choose, they can take over. And I think, and this is all anecdotal, but people are looking at the market, right? The market, and I'll say stocks, bonds, whatever, from the perspective of there's a little bit of unpredictability there, where if you have a business, or better yet, a business and some rental property, like, people are starting to think that way again and saying, hey, I'm going to bring my kids into it. So I'm not the only one who has said, let's create something that we can build to create both, a family legacy. And I it makes sense, but I never really thought, like, when I got out of the Army in 98, it was still, no, you go work for a big company for 20 years and you get a
Mm,
pension and
mm,
you're all taken care of. Well, corporate America taught us how that one-way loyalty works. And I think a
mm,
lot of the over 50-year-olds are, look and say, hey, you know what? Let's be scrappy. Let's be fun. Let's have a good time. And that, actually, I do want to say that, because I also think we're all having a blast
mm.
because the egos aren't there. Right. So, I can even remember, and I'm CEO right now. I might not be CEO, in 2 months, because I might be working on another project. And so it's very much like fluid like that. And it's not about, I'm going to make it's all about me and only I can, it's just not our thing. And it's more fun when it's that way, right? When someone whose job it isn't to make the decisions comes up with a great idea, knowing that that idea will be considered and a likely part of everybody's decision cycle, that's a healthy organization. And I think that just older people act, you've kind of done what you're going to do. All that you have is upside potential. And, and, I like to think that if you were some kind of like malignant narcissist, you're not going to make it past our vetting process either. But
Mm.
again, I just think it's trite to talk about 50s and maybe even 60s being like some of the best decades, but I think that they really can be if you take care of yourself,
Mm.
because you're either going to kind of do this kind of thing when you're younger, and that's great, or if you have a passion to do it and you can do it when you're older and you have the stamina, you got to take care of yourself to have the stamina, you can have a great time and
Hmm.
a lot of fun.
You've got great videos, Doug, of you cooking with your daughter
Yeah.
there and using the knife. They're really, really cool, really instructional, and just you're having fun there. What are the dangers of a dull knife?
It's like anything, right? It's using a tool in a way that is not intended from a safety and maintenance perspective. So any knife that you have should be appropriately sharp for the task that you're doing. The biggest problem is that if you're cutting, and the reason I don't like traditional knives, right, is there's play in your wrist. So if you're cutting and it's not sharp and it can slip,
Mm,
then you have a pretty good chance of cutting your finger. Now,
right.
the antidote to that is sharpen your knives, right? There's some really, really good, inexpensive sharpeners. We're going to be rolling one out that we recommend when we hard launch at the end of April ish. But it's and again, that the Nulu is great. It still needs to be kept sharp. So I think the dangers are cutting yourself. But I kind of look at it and say, if you're signing up to sort of do stuff in the kitchen, do the minimum to be safe.
Mm,
And I think some people do like serrated knives for that reason. And
mm,
um, that's legit, right? Like, serrated knives by nature are easier to maintain. And it's interesting. You indirectly bring up a good point about sharpness, because then you go down the serrated path, or what knife
mm,
is good for what. And the other thing I would say is, and I'm going to lead to this advice by having somebody say to me once, "Well, I want to feel like a chef."
mm,
And I look at it and I say, nobody cares. If you're in a room talking to people and you're preparing a meal, nobody cares, right? Like, realistically, it is, and this is not to disrespect what chefs learn, because the techniques and things are amazing and all, but do what works for you, right? The connection of doing a meal is in enjoying it and the synthesis of that meal itself, not what knife you're using with what technique. So we really have had some discussions, on some other podcasts internally as a team about part of the messaging being anything that makes your life better and easier to get to the point where you can sit down with a group of family or friends or anybody and bond over a meal. That's kind of what humanity is. We talked about, right, like history and knives and all that kind of stuff. Well, the whole meal concept, right? I can remember when I was stationed in Kuwait, and it was interesting, right? It was sort of like Middle East meets West, where we would go. There's a Kuwaiti major who hosted us one day, and they would bring out this spread of food, right? And it was very much about this, like, I guess in Middle Eastern culture, there's like this big aspect of like feeding people and making sure that you never leave the table hungry, right? Because it may be you someday who need to be helped by these people. And again, I'm probably getting that wrong, but it was really, really this interesting aspect of their culture. And then the American culture of you don't want to leave your plate with food on it, because then you're saying, right, that, so, it was, but that clash of aspects around meals was such a connection of, okay, like it is such an important part of every culture. So anything that you can do, if it can help grandma make a meal one more year, that is something that families want to do, it's worth the price of admission to buy this. So I hope that it creates more people cooking and not more chefs, right? Like when I was on another podcast and someone said, well, what do you like to cook? What kind of recipe or whatever? And I'm like, I just go to my pantry and say, wow, that would be good with that, right? And there are certain things that I've started to coalesce around, building a recipe for. But more than anything, it's like, hey, I'm just going to experiment today, because I like the creative process more than the process of following someone else's thing. But then, people don't say, wow, that was an amazing pizza that you made. Your cutting technique was fantastic, right? It's just not where the evaluation occurs, right? So, I don't know. That, I guess I kind of went off on a more like visionary component, but I do think it's important. I do think that, especially now, sharing meals with people, especially ones who may have, been, alienated or estranged. It's one of those things where at least over a meal, there's an agreement. Maybe the meal is good or whatever, but we got to do that. We got to find ways to connect, and hopefully that, maybe it can, maybe this can make the you in unity, right? Like, because we need a little bit of that. And I think it might start with meals and things like that.
I can tell you, Doug, I'm a novice hobbyist, chef like yourself, cook, and the greatest thing is I walk into that kitchen and it's relatively clean, it's clutter free. I start pulling ingredients out like yourself. I say, okay, I'm gonna mix this, see what I got, let's see what I can cook. I start feeding some people. I clean as I go because it's process, and then everybody gets fed. I kind of pick and feed too, and then I clean, and then I walk away from that kitchen the way I arrived, and I fed all those people. Nowhere in my life do I get to have a project that I get to see from beginning to end like that, and I'm an integral part of it. So just the satisfaction of not only feeding and talking and communing and unity, but also just seeing a project from beginning to end, and just the creativeness. Oftentimes that was great. What'd you do? And you say, I don't remember how much this and this I added, because this is what the ingredients I had. And it doesn't work all the time, but oftentimes it does.
Well, and I like it because you're kind of talking about that ritual, right? And I think that then becomes, when I talked about our headwinds, right? Like people look and they're like, I have a carving knife that my grandpa had, and I think it's cool. Like it looks like it was an old bayonet, like
Huh.
one that, straight bayonet, and that someone put like a handle on. It's just a cool knife, right? And
Yeah.
like I pull it out, it's like not a great knife. It's there's better ones for the task, but there's sort of a ritual around it, and I get that. I think that there's sort of a place in that world for all of that. But I love how you approach that, right? I love how it's like, but never did you say it was about the individual tools, right? It was sort of about going through the steps and creating while you're interacting. And, I think that anything, I think that we have a crisis of consumption. And I'm not the first to say it, but in everything we do, right? And it's the companies we work for are more about consumption and services. What we do is consumptive. What streaming channel am I going to watch to consume whatever? What meal delivery, and no disrespect to, like, what am I going to eat? And just there's less and less of that creation. And I think that the more that there is of that, the better. And it was when you were talking about it, right? That's a big part of it, right? Watching people's reactions, what worked, what didn't, what spice profiles work in this kind of thing.
Mm.
And there should be, as much as we can, a push toward momentum in that, right? And the interesting thing that you didn't talk about, but that I think is important, is, and there's two lessons, right? The first lesson, I'm wearing my Coast Guard Academy coat right now. My daughter is there, and she at one point she reached out a lot for, hey dad, like, what should I do, from this leadership question. And we were talking when she moved from being just a subordinate to her first leadership position. I said, number one, someone's watching all the time.
Mm.
So just assume that you can't get away with anything because someone is watching.
Mm.
And that was profound for her. But the reality is, it's true being a parent too.
Mm.
So if you're consistently cooking and you're worried about what's going into particular meals, and they're watching you go through that process, they're not going to pick it up somewhere else, right? They're not, unless they're taking a class on culinary stuff. So I think there is an aspect too of that being lessons that you're teaching that next generation about, hey, well, you own your nutrition. Like, if you end up in terrible condition, it's because you made that choice and you're accountable for that. But also that cooking isn't really a chore. I mean, it can be, but that it is really something to enjoy. And I think that's another thing that people really need to bring. If they want their kids to do it, they better start doing it.
Mm. Hmm. Doug, has there been anything in the last month or so that you changed your mind on?
Yes, and really with Nulu, it is the wider appeal, and I think it was being really too close. So, we get mixed messages, right? And it just means we might need better marketing messages. But people say, why do you call it adaptive? It's just a cool knife. And I've changed my mind that the not that people with no issues at all can look and say, this makes sense. This is a good knife. And changing my mind on that might not change our strategy. It might change some of our messaging.
Mm.
So I think that really is not to sell short the wider applicability, I guess.
So, Doug, I started my business in the '90s. I was working way too hard. I was a young man. I wasn't over 50 like we are, and I was putting my health in the back seat. And next thing you know, I'm at the doctor's office. I'm at 340 pounds, and she
No
said,
kidding.
"Yeah, yeah."
Wow.
She says to me, "If you don't lose this weight, you're not going to see your daughter graduate." I was never that big. I was,
Right.
so I spent the next 6-7 months, lost 130 pounds, kept it off. I was a 340, 46-inch waist. Now I'm, about 205, 32. So
Right.
you can't look at it as a finishing line, right? It's a lifelong changes. So when I tell people, excuse me, this story, automatically, what's your secret? What'd you do? And there's no secret, Doug. Discipline. That's how I kept it
Yeah.
off. I got willpower, motivation, etc. How does discipline play a role in your unique life, Douglas Katz?
I will say the military is good at doing that, right?
Yeah.
Like they're good at basically saying there's tasks you're going to not like doing.
Mm.
Suck it up, right? So I think that is part of it. And I do think that comes with age too. You asked about the over 50 thing. I think just people kind of just get it done and do that. But I think there's two sides of it, right? There's this tactical discipline of the day to day. You get up and do the jobs that suck, and you do what you got to do. The wider discipline, I think, becomes life changes that you're talking about. And for me, I do some writing and I do some things on the side, and I was trying to figure out a concept that really started to motivate me, and it was time. So in the last couple of years, I had been a caretaker for my father. He moved in with us when he was 87. He passed at 89. But if you look at that, if you don't look at that as an opportunity to understand your own journey, you're missing out. So I looked and I said, wow, if I'm lucky enough to live as long as he did, passing at 89 is a pretty good run, then what does that mean to the time that I've got left, right? And it's very easy to say, oh, I don't want to think about that, all that. So I looked at, okay, what if you look at your entire life that way? And I said, all right, well, if you live to 77, 78, which I think is the US Census average age, then 1.3% of your life is expended every year. That accelerates over time. Now, you might be lucky. If I live to 89, obviously that changes some of the math. But when you start to then look at it and say, not like a New Year's resolution that says, this year I'm going to do this. If you look and you say, I expended the potential of this much last year, and did I accomplish it? And did I get the ROI for that investment of time? And if you didn't, then the next year you better be looking and saying, and it's sort of grim, right? Like it's looking and saying the one finish line is flatline, right? And that's okay because we're all going to end up there. I even have a tattoo that I got on my 25th wedding anniversary of Father Time and Mother Nature, right? They're immutable. That's been the discipline to say, stay the course. It's really, really easy to get to the point of discouragement and then go, I'm just going to go with what worked. But you're going to turn around and then those years aren't going to be 1.3 or 1.5%. You're going to be getting to 5, 6, 10%. And it's like anything else, right? If you don't put money away every year, it's hard to make up that delta. If you don't start living the kind of life you want to, and notwithstanding, it takes a lot, but there's more resources than ever before to do it, then it's a choice. And that's what's really kept me disciplined on keeping the business going and not faltering when I'm like, okay, is this crazy? Should I go back and do, what I know works or whatever? And frankly, I think right now the uncertainty should be a driving force for people because uncertainty means that otherwise secure jobs or what were jobs that people thought were secure are no longer that, right? The whatever you feel about what's going on with the government employees, many of them felt that there was in exchange for hard work and lower pay, some degree of job security. That's gone. If that's gone in that sector, it's gone in general. And I think people need to start owning that aspect. They will definitely vote differently for the type of policies that would help small inventors, independent inventors, small business, things like that. You would see a shift in where that money goes because it should go toward leveling the play field for small business against big business.
Yeah, it certainly should. Well said. Doug, what motivates you?
It's interesting. I would be lying if I said money didn't, but for me, it's the money for freedom to do, not only to live the lifestyle I do, and I do not live high on the hog, right? I drive a Hyundai. So, and I don't know that I would want to drive anything more than that, right? It's a pleasurable drive and it gets me where I'm going, and I can use other resources for other things. So I feel right now what motivates me, I think, is really helping, right? Like however I can. So I really do look and say, and I'm sure everybody says this, right? If there's a point where I have wealth more than I expected to have in my lifetime, I do feel I would want to put those resources toward greater good beyond myself, right? I can set my kids up if I've parented well without having to have a buffer in there for bad decisions that they might make. That's on them. If I can create the right legacy, then great. Then they're taken care of if they so choose to make those decisions. But if I could get other money and help, let's say, disabled vets, I'm a sucker for animals, right? Like we have 4 rescue dogs. There might be one barking if my wife comes home, so I'm going to apologize. But those kind of causes, right? I think that, and I listen. I think like looking at things now, how the world is, and I do feel a pretty big imbalance. I think it is the gut check, right? I think people do have to decide what motivates them. And it doesn't mean that you can't hold in high esteem building wealth and a good life for one's family. The question becomes, right, like, what your motivation is? Great. Wonderful. Then I at least know what makes you tick. I don't think that's where I'm at. I have had so many people who look at their success being in my agency and helping me out that there comes a dopamine rush to that, right? And I don't even right now consider us being successful enough, right? I think the knife will be successful. I've got an experienced knife guy on the team. He's a good judge of that. I think that our feedback is that it'll be successful. That's great, but it's not, I don't dream of flying a private jet to Fiji, right? Like what would be great for me. I have a West Point classmate who made it big, and I hope I don't embarrass him by calling him out. His name's Joseph Kopser. And when he got out, he made very good money in the exit in a technology company. His first inclination was, how does he give back? And he's done a ton in the West Point entrepreneurial and Service Academy entrepreneurial circles. There are other people involved with some of the accelerators like Warrior Rising, IVMF, the Institute for Veteran Military Families, Founders Institute. I'm actually going into one of theirs. All these people are giving back, and many are volunteers. And I think that becomes inspirational. And how excited they are when they hear that you've hit a milestone, right? For them, that's almost the same excitement that you get as a parent. And that, I think that inspires me right now, right? Like that's the life-changing stuff. And it's better than writing a check, right? It's really, really making some cool stuff happen.
Looking for a powerful way to reach business leaders and engage consumers? The Joey Pinz podcast connects brands like yours with an audience that listens, engages, and takes action. High impact exposure with a fast growing loyal audience. Millions of views and listens across major platforms. Sponsors see increased brand awareness, trust, and conversations. We make sponsorships simple and effective with custom ad placements that fit your brand, deep audience engagement through authentic conversations, long-term exposure across podcast platforms and social media. Don't miss the opportunity to connect with your ideal customers. Visit joeypinz.com/sponsor to secure your sponsorship today. Or you can email us at sales@joeypinz.com. The Joey Pinz podcast, where conversations drive results. So given that motivation, Doug, how do you measure success?
Well, it's going to be easy for the knife, right? Like I've got to measure success in that I am at a point where I have enough disposable income to do that. So I think that is, I don't think you have to be an impact company and go away from, hey, we can, redefine cutting and still be, I think when we looked at the market recently, just even the smaller part, you're talking 1.3 billion, it's a decent market. I think my success is going to be in individual stories, right? Like it's going to be helping a veteran like me, or we also as an organization would love to find disabled entrepreneurs who frankly are not taken seriously but have good ideas. You want to talk about people who have innovation to solve their problems that likely will also translate to able-bodied people. That's a great community, but they just don't have a means to get to where they're going. So if we can do that, then that'll be great, and our success will be defined in the success stories of the people that we help create.
Most certainly. Well, Doug, you're an inspiration, man. This is really, really cool. I'm glad we set this up and looking forward to talking to you. I love what you're doing. I love your videos.
Thank
Anybody
you.
watching or listening, how can they get in touch with you?
The best way for me, I've got a big digital footprint. Any Google search, if they're on LinkedIn, easy to find me. I will give you my link tree to include with this if you want, and that's what I'm tending to keep up to date because it's just an easy place to do it. So this is on an example will be on there, or just go to anything Nulu Knives related. Nulu is a acronym for like different things. So we found that great knife name. But if you go nuluknives.com, that's our website. It's our Shopify site. As you said, I've got a pretty big digital footprint on social, and it means a lot to me that you talked about the videos with my daughter. That was a little bit of a flyer. I'll be honest. She's awesome, right? As I said, she's at the Coast Guard Academy, and when she's home, we try and do those. And I was a little bit dubious, but she's good at it. So she's coming home for spring break. We're going to hopefully do some cooking during that period of time because we do have a lot of fun doing that. So we're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, and then all the other social media platforms.
And Nulu's Nulu.
Yes. So it comes actually, we talked earlier about the ulu, which is a indigenous knife, an Inuit knife. So this is in a sense the new ulu, that brings it up into the 21st century.
Very good. And yeah, Linktree, Doug Katz, and LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, Threads, and we're all there. Oh, finally, yes.
There he goes.
There he goes.
Sorry about that.
Great talking with you. You be well. Next time I'm in your neighborhood, we'll get a cup of tea.
I'm sorry, say again?
Next time I'm in your area, we'll get a cup of tea. You be well.
Absolutely, my friend. Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypinz.com. There you'll find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations.